Buonasera a tutti. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that all those who will not be able to follow in English have been provided with headsets, and I thank from the very beginning the person who will assure the translation tonight. We celebrate this evening the closing of the second year in the 3-year program of the Center, 2016-2018. The strategic plan for the 3 years has been redefined at a time when the Center has been given and has chosen a new mission for religion and innovation. This mission is new to the Center, and this mission comes from the desire to have the Center as integrated in FBK as possible. FBK has grown as a research institution axed on innovation in science and technology and beyond, including in social innovation. And all the components of FBK are part of this legacy and are part of this effort and are committed to further developing Fondazione Kessler as a research institution carrying on innovation in different areas. This choice of religion and innovation as a mission comes not out of the blue for a center which has been in existence for 40 years. 40 years in the city of the Council of Trent, 40 years of research on religion in a very special place for reform, reformation, change, and tradition. Adopting a mission on religion and innovation is a part of the renewal of Fondazione Kessler, of our center, but it's also a part of paying tribute to a legacy. It's a part of our effort to carry on an extremely prestigious tradition. You will find outside the program of events for the 2018 of our center, thanks to the effort of the researchers of the center who are here tonight with us, we are able tonight to present a workshop and lecture series for 2018 devoted precisely to religion and innovation. We are entering our final year in this very special task to discover our mission, to further develop our mission, and this program of workshops and lecture series will be precisely devoted to this goal. Workshops will take place, as you will be able to check in the program, almost every month of the year. International experts will be involved. The description of the program is in English, since the workshops will be in English. But there will be a parallel program in Italian, stemming from our desire to share with the people of this land our research. So that's why we will present a program of, at the same time, research workshops in English, and directly connected to those workshops, a program of conferences in Italian accessible to the general public. This will not be to separate strings of events for us, since what we have to offer to the citizens of Trento and beyond, even to those who will not be able to access research workshops, is a program coming from the research workshops. So that's why you will find outside both the program of the workshops and events in English and the program in Italian, this small card. Religion and innovation means a lot of things for us. Great task in scientific terms. What does it mean to investigate the interaction of religion and innovation? We've been struggling with this, our researchers, myself, a lot of visiting people. Anthony will be a part of this investigation tonight. I want to thank everybody for sharing this effort. And I also want to mention at this stage that this effort does not belong only to the Center for Religious Studies. It belongs to FBK as a whole. It belongs to the other centers. It belongs to those researchers from other centers, including those researchers from POVO, from the Centers for Science and Technology uphill, who've been designing research projects together with us. This program for 2018 and this focus on religion innovation is the way we think of developing our center. Now, this development is meant to be solidly rooted in this land, in the people of this land, and at the same time to be able to make sense beyond. We've been able to strengthen partnership, long-standing partnerships. In these 2 years, we've been able to start new ones. I would like to mention just the most recent one, and that's the partnership with Al-Farabi University in Kazakhstan. And thanks to the fact that this conference is offered on streaming live, and although it's very late there, I wish to say thank you for colleagues in Kazakhstan who are connected with us tonight. They will be here. 3 students, master students from Al-Farabi and the director of the Center for Religious Studies. They will visit our center in January and February. They are already with us tonight, and I wish to thank them for this. Religion innovation is about a unity in mission on FBK, connecting the past, the present, and the future. And tonight we celebrate the end of the 2nd year of the center and the opening of the 3rd year with a lecture which is not isolated in character. It's a lecture which belongs to a series of lectures started last year. And these lectures have a name, and this name is Davide Zordan. I'm very grateful for the family of Davide to be here tonight with us. And this name speaks to us in both terms of past and future. This name speaks to us in terms of building to a strong legacy to which Davide has contributed tremendously, and to the future that we will be able to build thanks to his effort. And here again, I want to thank my center and to thank researchers on my center for having produced this beautiful Riflessioni in ricordo di Davide Zordan that is again available outside. And now it's the time to give the floor to Paolo Costa and then to Anthony Carrol for the lecture tonight. The theme and approach of Davide Zordan Lectures are based on renewal of theology, innovation in theology. And I'm very grateful to Anthony for being here tonight. He comes from a very prestigious research and teaching institution based in London, Anthrop College. And so I wish to thank him both in the name of his university who made it possible for him to be with us tonight, and personally, individually, for the effort you made to draft this lecture, to come to Trento to deliver it, and to be open to a Q&A session immediately afterwards. Paolo Costa, one of the researchers of the center, has been for much in the design of the Davide Zordan Lectures in general, and this one in particular. Thank you very much to you as well, and you have the floor for a more detailed introduction. Thank you.
Grazie, passo all'italiano perché le cose che vi dirò non saprei dire in inglese. Quindi, prima cosa che vi devo dire, oltre a ringraziare il direttore per il sostegno nell'organizzazione di questo evento e ringraziare tutti voi di essere qui stasera per la seconda edizione della Davide Zordan Lecture. Vedo volti familiari, volti molto cari, e questo mi rende felice, mi riempie il cuore stasera. Dopo aver avuto con noi l'anno scorso uno dei protagonisti della teologia del XX secolo, Harvey Cox, ci accingiamo oggi ad ascoltare una voce non meno autorevole della teologia e della filosofia della religione contemporanea, Anthony Carrol, che ringrazio molto per aver accettato il nostro invito. Giunti alla seconda edizione, possiamo dire che cominciamo a vedere una piccola tradizione, un embrione di tradizione prendere forma davanti ai nostri occhi. Per molti aspetti è un po' come vedere fiorire i germi piantati da Davide nella sua vita breve ma intensa. La Davide Zordan Lecture è un'occasione rituale con una duplice finalità. Ci dà anzitutto la possibilità ogni anno di onorare e rinnovare pubblicamente il ricordo di Davide. Se volete, combattiamo così una piccola lotta contro l'oblio, contro la forza corrosiva, erosiva del tempo. Questo sforzo è particolarmente doveroso in questo caso perché la vita di Davide, che si è interrotta bruscamente poco più di 2 anni fa, era una vita ricca di promesse, non solo per lui stesso e la cerchia dei suoi cari, la sua famiglia, e gli amici, ma per tutta la nostra piccola comunità scientifica, per il Trentino, per il mondo intero nel suo insieme. Per consentire a chi non l'ha conosciuto personalmente di farsi almeno una piccola idea di ciò di cui sto parlando, abbiamo preparato per questa occasione un piccolo opuscolo con delle 4 brevi riflessioni sull'eredità intellettuale di Davide e l'eredità che lui ha lasciato dietro di sé. Chi non lo avesse appunto tra le mani lo può recuperare e consiglio vivamente di recuperarlo dopo la fine della lecture. Il lavoro della memoria a cui ci dedichiamo oggi, come dicevo, è doveroso, ma è anche spontaneo. Basta infatti rileggere gli scritti di Davide per avvertire il desiderio e l'urgenza di proseguire nella direzione che egli stesso ci ha indicato e continuare la conversazione con lui attraverso i temi che gli erano cari. È così che salta subito agli occhi la seconda finalità della Davide Zordan Lecture. Le conferenze che organizziamo annualmente hanno un obiettivo culturale principale: tenere viva una certa concezione della riflessione teologica. Una teologia concreta, non paludata, mi verrebbe da dire urbana. È la teologia che Davide ha incarnato in maniera esemplare nei suoi scritti, nel suo insegnamento. Secondo Davide, la teologia non può esistere al di fuori di un'esperienza di fede, ma la sua idea di fede, la sua concezione della fede era tutt'altro che ristretta, angusta, era profondamente inclusiva. Fede è per lui anzitutto, lo si legge bene nei suoi ultimi scritti, fiducia, affidamento, fedeltà, esperienze umane originarie che sono familiari a tutti e che rappresentano una sfida per ciascuno di noi. Una sfida per la mente e per il cuore. La fede era per Davide quindi essenzialmente un modo di stare al mondo, un modo amichevole di stare al mondo, addirittura uno stile personale, diciamo così, che è forse la caratteristica della sua personalità che rimane più impressa nella memoria e anziché sbiadire si rafforza col trascorrere del tempo. È uno stile, per come me lo ricordo io, appunto rigoroso e amichevole. Ed è proprio lo stile che ricerchiamo nei relatori della Davide Zordan Lecture. Insomma, per farla breve, cerchiamo in loro sia uno stile intellettuale che un abito di umanità. Quando ho ascoltato per la prima volta Anthony Carrol nel marzo del 2015 a Roma al convegno internazionale Renewal, the Church in a Secular Age, mi è parso proprio di vedere all'opera quell'idea di teologia che Davide mi aveva fatto apprezzare negli anni. Invitarlo a tenere la Davide Zordan Lecture è stato quindi una conseguenza quasi naturale di quell'incontro, di quell'esperienza. Come sapete, Carroll viene da Londra, appunto, come ha detto anche il direttore, dove insegna all'Anthrop College. Si è occupato nella sua vita del tema della secolarizzazione, ha scritto un libro molto importante su Weber, l'idea di secolarizzazione, e recentemente ha curato insieme a Richard Norman un volume proprio sul tema di cui parlerà stasera, il dialogo tra credenti e non credenti. Molte delle parole chiave della sua relazione, rinnovamento, disaccordo, spiritualità, entrano in risonanza con piste di ricerca che si perseguono nel nostro centro. Esistono, credo, quindi le condizioni ideali per una conversazione amichevole e rigorosa a cui invito tutti a partecipare. E a partecipare senza remore, senza timidezze. Penso che l'esempio di Davide ci possa servire da guida in proposito. Ho detto tutto, quindi lascio la parola a Anthony Carrol, che ringrazio ancora per aver accettato di essere qui con noi stasera.
Prima di iniziare la mia relazione, voglio ringraziare la Fondazione Bruno Kessler e specialmente il professor Paolo Costa, che mi ha gentilmente invitato a tenere la Davide Zordan Lecture 2017. Soprattutto sono estremamente felice di poter condividere e scambiare con voi idee su un tema sul quale ho lavorato molto negli ultimi anni. il significato del dialogo tra i credenti e i non credenti e le implicazioni di tale dialogo per la teologia e la filosofia. Mi dispiace di non essere in grado al momento di svolgere la mia relazione in italiano. Mea culpa, mea grandissima colpa, no? Vi prego di scusarmi, perciò se questo sarà parlerò in inglese. Let me turn to English now. Let me begin this lecture by saying that I have been working for 3 years very closely with a group of religious believers and non-religious people to begin a dialogue of searching for ways to innovate. So I hope the lecture tonight will be very much in that tradition of the center of looking for ways to innovate in our understanding of the world, especially of religion within the world. In this lecture, I will explore how dialogue between religious believers and non-religious believers can be a source of renewal in contemporary theology and philosophy of religion. Starting with an investigation of the nature of religious disagreement, I will draw on my recent experience of dialogue with the non-religious to outline some of the key issues that have arisen in these exchanges and to sketch how these might be fruitfully developed through further theological and philosophical exploration. I conclude by arguing that the reasons for the rejection of religious belief by significant numbers of people today indicate an agenda of research and innovation into what it means to be human and of how to speak with credibility about transcendence in the 21st century. Let me say that in delivering the Davide Zordan Lecture, I am also aware that for some of you here, this lecture will evoke the memory of a personal friend and colleague whom you mourn the loss of through this memorial lecture, and especially for the family who remember David this evening. Thank you especially to the family for being here tonight. So I hope that our evening may be a fitting occasion to honor the memory of a very fine theologian who sought to explore how to speak about religious matters in the contemporary world in a way which brings philosophy and theology into a fruitful dialogue. Disagreements about religious belief. What does it mean to disagree about a religious belief? This is an important question to begin our discussion, and I know that it ties into work going on in the Center of Religious Studies here at the Fondazione Bruno Kessler. It is an important question because it problematizes the issue of what we mean by religious belief and non-belief, and cautions us against assuming too easily that we know what we mean when we say someone is religious or not. As discussions on the definition of religion have taught us, things seem to be clear up until the point that we try to explain them. Once we begin to open up to the complexity of these issues, we become much less sure that we have got things as clear as we thought we had. One way social scientific research attempts to get around this problem is by considering someone as religious who self-declares to be so, and someone as not religious who denies that they are religious. But one has to be careful in taking for granted what people say about themselves. And in the case of being religious or not, there are competing understandings of what it means to be religious, which further complicate the matter. Am I religious if I assent to creedal statements? Am I religious if I take part in certain practices? Or, as the theologian and philosopher Friedrich Schleiermacher will say, is it a certain feeling of absolute dependence on someone or in something greater than myself which makes me religious? So it is important to recognize that people may use different categories to describe themselves as being religious or not, and mean different things by what they affirm or deny about themselves. The way that I want to approach this question is through sketching a philosophical anthropology of key religious and non-religious characteristics. Having taught at university and also worked as a priest for many years, I have also done my own field work in this area. And since I published a joint edited volume on the topic of religious atheist dialogue with a friend and colleague of mine who is an atheist, I have had the privilege of taking part in a number of discussions on this topic with various religious believers and non-religious believers. These discussions and observations have taken place against a background of the social perception of a significant emergence of non-religious belief in Britain, as evidenced in September 2017 by the National Centre for Social Research, Britain's largest independent social research agency, which published data revealing that the proportion of people in Britain who declare themselves to have no religion has risen to 53% of the population. That's 53% of the population. Just quite what these figures mean, I would suggest, should not be assumed to be self-evident for the reasons outlined above. But these figures do represent a recognizable change in the religious landscape of some, but clearly not all, parts of Europe today. So, if amongst the various possible ways of defining what it means to be religious, we take belief in the existence of God as paradigmatic of what characterizes religious belief, or at least theistic religious belief, how should we understand disagreement about the existence of God? When we disagree about where we have left the front door key, the disagreement is about an object, the key located somewhere in time and space. But when we disagree about whether God exists or not, we are not dealing with a disagreement about an object in time and space. If God is, as described by St. Thomas Aquinas, both being itself, esse, and a personal transcendent being, an id quod est, then disagreeing about the existence of God is a highly complex matter. It involves taking, or at least implying, a position on the nature of existence and its ontological ground, and also on whether there is a transcendent being. In the case of God, one also needs to be even more cautious about terminology, because in the strict sense, the strict literal sense, the literal terms, one cannot speak of the existence of God, existere, the cause forth to stand concept, which is existence. Because God stands outside of the causal realm. God transcends the existence of the creation and is not caused forth to stand. A simple way, perhaps, to think of this theological and philosophical distinction is to say that whilst creation has existence, God is existence. Clearly, most of our disagreements are not usually about issues such as the nature of existence, human and divine. But there are other types of disagreement which might at least bear some family resemblances to such disagreements. Disagreements about music, for example, whether Beethoven is better than the Beatles, or Bach, and so on. And then again, political disagreements about whether one party or another represents the better way forward for a country, share some of these characteristics. These value judgments as to whether one type of music is better than another, or of whether one political approach is more suitable than another, clearly have overlaps with what is going on in religious disagreements. They cannot be solved by simply pointing to some empirical object, such as the front door key, and saying, "Look, here it is." But rather, they require that we take into consideration how people come to these judgments and whether they are based on sound reasoning. Sound reasoning here, of course, is not so easy to adjudicate upon. Once you satisfy the basic conditions of conclusions following from premises and so on, the matter quickly becomes complicated by the fact that people reason based on their experience. But getting to the bottom of people's experience is seldom straightforward. And even for the person themselves, these anthropological aspects of reasoning can be buried in a lifetime of experiences. In other words, reasoning about issues such as religious belief or unbelief requires us to take into account the embeddedness of our rationality in personal life projects and experiences. The German social theorist Max Weber alluded to the difficulties of getting to grips with these issues by using the idea of musical ability to speak about the nature of religious disagreement. He famously called himself religiously unmusical. And this was something which for him was a cause of suffering in an increasingly disenchanted and secularized world. As Weber says, he found himself like a cripple. Weber's use of the metaphor of musical ability as a means to understand religious belief opens up this broader anthropological dimension to religious disagreement, which I have found in some contemporary atheists. Here is how Raymond Tallis, an atheist and English scientist and philosopher, puts this point in a dialogue with the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. I quote, "For many people, in a sense, arguments about God are pointless. It primarily is an experience or fire in the head, or whatever you want to call it. And arguments, in a sense, are rather after the fact, a matter of defending yourself, your experience, against somebody who has not shared that experience. The reason I'm saying this is because in many ways I worry as an atheist that I just simply haven't had the experience, rather than that I have a very good argument against the existence of God." End of quote. In other words, the nature of the disagreement is poorly understood when it is considered to be reducible to epistemic disagreement, a disagreement based on understanding a set of arguments, whether these be empirical or normative. As Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, says in reply to Raymond Tallis, I quote, "If good arguments against or for the existence of God were as good arguments as they think they are, then the world would be either full of people like Richard Dawkins, or it would be full of people like whoever else you want to name. And because the world is not full of complete idiots, presumably there is something else going on here than just argument." End quote. Let me be clear here. I am not saying that in the exchange between the religious and the non-religious, arguments play no part. Of course they do. Otherwise, a lot of philosophers of religion would be wasting their time. However, and this ties in with my recent experience of dialogue between the religious and the non-religious, there's something else going on here than just argument that Rowan Williams refers to should not simply be explained by the fact that one side or another does not understand the arguments. Rather, as John Wisdom put it in the parable of the invisible gardener, it seems that it is possible for each side to understand one another's arguments and still to draw different, reasonable conclusions. In the parable, Wisdom recounts the story of two people returning to a long-neglected garden, but who nevertheless find some plants still doing well. After considering the available facts of the matter and all the possibilities of interpretation, one person believes that a gardener comes unseen and unheard to tend the garden, whilst the other person believes that there is no gardener. Wisdom concludes the parable by raising the questions: is it any longer appropriate to ask which is right or which is reasonable? This is what we call in the philosophy of science the underdetermination of the theory by the data. We might understand wisdom's point here by drawing on the idea of the so-called Gestalt Switch, in which it is possible to see an image in two different ways. Famous examples of this, which you may have seen, include the images of the chalice or the two faces, the old lady or the hat, and the duck or the rabbit. The idea here is that you can see an image in two different ways, dependent upon how your mind processes the information as a totality. You cannot view both options at the same time, but need to switch between them. A similar idea is used by Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinov in their book, The Grand Design, when they talked about the notion of model-dependent realism. This is their way of cutting through the philosophical debate over realism and anti-realism, the objectivism and subjectivism issue, and to suggest that different models of reality can agree with observation, and so one is free to use the more convenient model that better fits the situation. The classic example of this is the wave-particle duality of light. In some circumstances, the wave nature of light is the best model to use to understand the behavior of light, and in other circumstances, the particle nature of light is the best model to use. Asking which model is the correct one or more real one is missing the point. Just as saying, is it either a chalice or two faces, is missing the point in the Gestalt Switch example. Different positions are reasonable in different situations. So, if this is the case, how might this switching phenomenon shed light on the analogous duality in the religious and non-religious dialogue? This is what I mean by the biographical or anthropological dimension of the religious and non-religious dialogue. The life story and history of a person in the dialogue will be the lens through which they view the evidence, sift the information, give various weighting to particular judgments, and seek to find a coherent correspondence between theory and practice in their own life experience. In other words, in matters of religious belief and non-belief, one's own personal experience is crucial to which position one takes. The importance of personal experience. One way to think about the significance of personal experience in taking a particular stance is in Feuerbachian terms. For the German philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach, God is our projection, which alienates us from realizing our full potential and inverts the true subject of history, which for Feuerbach is the human person. If one's image of God is like Feuerbach's, that is to say, alienating and disempowering, then it is not hard to understand how perception of such an image leads to a negative experience of God. Just as looking at a horrible picture of death and destruction evokes feelings of repulsion in us, so too viewing God as a tyrant evokes a rejection of this image. Such a judgmental, controlling, and enervating or de-energizing image of God held by Feuerbach is one which sadly far too many people have suffered under. Another Hegelian philosopher, Karl Marx, would quite rightly attack this conception of religion as providing opium for the people. In fact, if one reads the recent work of the so-called new atheists, the image of God, which they often reject, shares much in common with that of Feuerbach and with the general skepticism that religious belief and rational scientific inquiry are compatible. In other words, just how one experiences belief or unbelief in a personal life story seems to be a crucial factor in coming to a position, and yet clearly there is no one way to experience these positions. For some, religious belief goes hand in hand with rational inquiry. For others, it is more a matter of intuitive acceptance. Some non-religious believers have been former religious believers and have come to later reject this belief, whilst for others they have never entertained religious belief seriously. The simple fact of believing in God or not is not experienced homogeneously by these different groups. Nevertheless, if a person claims a belief in God, it is not unreasonable to expect that they see their life as somehow involved with transcendence, what some theistic religious traditions, such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, call God. Just how this involvement with transcendence is described and lived depends on the particular person and tradition in question. It may be that a person has a belief in God but seldom prays or participates in religious services. The belief may be a vestige of their past, which they have never properly examined. It may, on the other hand, be very much part of how they understand themselves, of how they behave towards others, of whether they engage in spiritual practices such as prayer, and so on. In this latter situation, belief in God both shapes how a person understands their general experience and also furnishes the person with distinctive experiences, such as those of praying, taking part in religious ceremonies, and using religious language to account for reality. This combination of how people understand their general experience and the presence of distinctive experiences in some people distinguishes the religious and the non-religious. While the non-religious have much experience in common with the religious, just how this general experience is understood may differ significantly between them, and particular experiences of prayer, participating in religious ceremonies, and using religious language tend not to be a typical part of the experiential repertoire of the non-religious, whilst they do for the religious. Consequently, one way that we can distinguish between the two groups is by the fact that non-religious traditions and philosophies do not see the meaning of their lives as bound up with transcendence. That is to say, transcendence in a religious sense. This gives rise to both differences of perspective on general shared human experience, and also furnishes each group with a different inventory of human experience upon which they can draw. Transcendence and imminence. If my sketch of what distinguishes the religious from the non-religious person is correct, then clarifying what each means by transcendence will allow us to better understand the issues at stake in adopting one or other of these positions. To begin to answer this question, allow me to outline some different ways of thinking about transcendence. If I say the workload given to me transcended my powers to do it, we understand that it was just too much for me to do a certain job. Flat out working 24/7, I just couldn't manage it. So a first definition of transcendence is that which exceeds one's capacities to achieve. Another meaning of transcendence is when I go beyond my usual capacity and do something extraordinary. I may beat the 3-hour mark in a marathon race, run into a burning house and save a child, or do much better in an examination than was predicted. This meaning of transcendence involves going beyond my ordinary limits and achieving something great. Let's call this second definition the self-transcendence meaning of transcendence. A third definition of transcendence involves specifically religious transcendence. Transcendence in a religious sense, or Christian sense at least, is by its very nature not a spatio-temporal category. Therefore, thinking of it in literal terms of extensions or crossing boundaries, capacities, durations, and locations entangles us in inappropriately imposing immanent categories, that is, spatio-temporal categories, on this type of transcendence. Transcendence in this religious sense can only be spoken of analogically. That is, with the awareness that this way of describing it is picture painting, pointing a finger at the moon, but not the moon itself. We do this when we speak of heaven and eternity as places and times, as if there is a sort of metaphysical double-decker bus model of reality, with the ground floor being the spatio-temporal realm and the upper floor being the really interesting realm of transcendence where you get the best views from. For a great deal of human history, we have employed the double-decker bus model for relating immanence, the spatio-temporal realm, and transcendence, the non-spatio-temporal realm. So-called axial religions and philosophies in the first millennium before the Common Era have used this model to generate our critical theoretical thinking, which has issued in religions, philosophies, and indeed science itself. Perhaps we are now entering in the dialogue between the religious and the non-religious, somewhat falteringly, no doubt, into a way of speaking about transcendence, which is less of the double-decker variety to account for the discontinuity between transcendence and immanence, but also less of the materialist, reductionist variety, which reduces transcendence to immanence in order to establish continuity. To my mind, we require two fundamentally new ways of talking about transcendence and immanence that pay due respect to both their continuity and discontinuity. On the one hand, we need a new way of speaking about a kind of immanence, transcendence continuum, analogous to the space-time continuum models in contemporary physics, a kind of metaphysical Möbius band language where the notions of inside and outside are reconfigured. The Möbius band or Möbius strip is a surface with only one side and one boundary, made by turning a piece of paper and joining the ends. You can draw a pencil or pen mark on the paper and you never leave it and go all the way around. It was discovered by the German mathematician Möbius and has given rise to fascinating new ideas of spatial thinking, topology in mathematics and physics. Mystical writers such as Johannes Tauler, John of the Cross, and Teresa of Avila sought to express this aspect of the immanence transcendence continuum through the language of their time in speaking of the indwelling of God in the soul. And their poetry and prose continues to inspire us as we seek new ways to express this continuity in the language of our time. On the other hand, we also need a new way to speak about the discontinuity between transcendence and immanence, which avoids talking about transcendence as if it were a supernatural extension of and opposition to nature. Talking of transcendence in these terms imposes natural concepts, categories, and limitations on that which by its very nature cannot be captured in this way. We might call this new project for theology and philosophy a search for a transcendent, immanent Gestalt Switch, which respects both continuity and discontinuity between transcendence and immanence without reducing one to the other. Through the dialogue between religious believers and non-religious believers, I think we are beginning to see the issues at stake in working out such new ways of talking about continuity and discontinuity with respect to imminence and transcendence, which provide an agenda of research for contemporary theology and philosophy. In my experience of this dialogue, the Feuerbachian notion of God still lingers in the collective imagination in such a way that animates conceptions of transcendence which are equivalent to varieties of anti-humanism. The discontinuity between transcendence and imminence is here articulated as one of opposition. Transcendence becomes the idealization of the subject, externally projected onto a fictitious, supernatural other, which alienates the subject from self-awareness and inverts the subject of history. Moreover, in the much discussed theodicy question of how a good God can allow so much evil and suffering in the world, it is this picture of transcendence which reveals God to be either a fictitious impostor or a supernatural psychopath reveling in the suffering of the innocent. This Feuerbachian conception of transcendence clearly clashes with the understanding proposed by the Gospels, in which Christ is said to bring us the fullness of life. In other words, in this Christian conception, transcendence is mediated to imminence in terms of flourishing and not through the imposition of suffering. Feuerbach and the Gospel of John clearly provide two diametrically opposed conceptions of divine transcendence based on different accounts of the continuity and discontinuity of transcendence and imminence. The challenge for theology and philosophy at this time is to articulate what it means for human flourishing to be interconnected with the divine life in a non-oppositional way that is life-giving rather than alienating from our true selves. I would suggest that a more fitting way to embark on this challenge is for theology to take as its point of departure the weakness of God, as expressed in the logic of the cross, rather than the former metaphysics of a strong supernaturalism. In order to do this, transcendence needs to be reimagined not simply as a plus or an added extra, a kind of turbocharge to human nature, which eliminates evil through power, but rather as itself constitutive of who we are as both beautiful and vulnerable persons. We might call this an immanence transcendence continuum account of philosophical anthropology. Furthermore, the tragic dimension of existence also needs to be incorporated into this understanding of how transcendence and immanence relate in such a way that overcomes the apathetic and distant account of God, untouched by suffering. In order to do this, Christian theology needs to contemplate afresh the vertiginous depths of Holy Week in such a way that neither flees superficially to an inevitable resurrection on Easter Sunday, nor remains entombed in death on Good Friday. In the dialogue between the religious and the non-religious, our atheist friends and colleagues may be teaching religious believers something about the death of God, which theology has struggled to be attentive to in its preoccupation to speak of the mystery of divine kenosis or of divine self-emptying in terms of an ultimate logic of power. This inattention, particularly in the Western Church, has led to a lack of theological and pastoral reflection on the significance of Holy Saturday in the Paschal Mystery. Caught between the sufferings of Good Friday and the glory of Easter Sunday, Holy Saturday has somehow been lost in the drama of Holy Week. But with its themes of the harrowing of hell, the divine rest, and the victory over death, it invites us to enter more profoundly in this liminal space between Good Friday and Easter Sunday. It is in this space, we might call it a theological Möbius space, that the transformation of death occurs in such a way that the marks of the wounds remain. Transcendence does not wipe away these corporeal marks inscribed on the immanence of the flesh. On the contrary, Jesus uses these marks to demonstrate to St. Thomas that it is truly him. Scepticism and the renewal of theology. This topological, spatial transformation of immanence and transcendence in the resurrected body of Christ is the paradigmatic example of how dialogue with skeptics leads to renewal in theology. Were Thomas not to have doubted, we would not have had this episode in the Gospel of John. The doubts and the questions of Thomas about the resurrection elicit this dialogue in which Christ displays the vulnerability of immanence present in the transcendence of the resurrected body. It seems that in the resurrection of Christ, time and space are not so much abrogated as remembered in the transformed body. This materialization of memory in the wounds of the risen Christ marks transcendence with the biography and the history of immanence. The wounded body connects the two in a continuity of shared identity. The crucified Jesus is the resurrected Christ. But it also marks a discontinuity through the announcement by the Christ that happy are those who have not seen and yet believe. Such a discontinuity characterizes the life of faith which knows through unknowing. This is a type of knowing which impoverishes all images of God. Yet through such a process, the skeptical moment of atheism is both preserved and transformed. It is preserved in a cognitive skepticism about grasping God in conceptual thought, but it is transformed into mystical union with God by a love that comes to say with St. Thomas, "My Lord and my God." As I conclude this lecture, it is only fitting that we turn our thoughts to the one in whose name we are gathered here this evening. Davide Zordan, as you will know better than I, David, as well as being a theologian, was an expert in cinema and president of the International Film Festival of Religion here in Trento. Davide Zordan knew that the medium of the cinema was a fertile one to renew old theological ideas and to reimagine classical religious themes. It is because of this powerfully creative capacity of film that the cinematic medium of communication is an excellent means through which the religious and the non-religious can meet today to explore just how imminence and transcendence might be reimagined for the future. An example of this happened to me recently when I was in a religious and non-religious dialogue in Sheffield Cathedral in northern England. During the evening, one of the panel, an atheist, mentioned the 1987 film Babette's Feast, which, as you may know, is a film about a woman, Babette, who enters the home of two sisters who preside over a strict Lutheran sect in Denmark, formerly ministered to by their now dead father. The sect is very austere and take little pleasure in life. They are also much divided amongst themselves, and though meeting to celebrate the word each week, lack the communion which they once had when their pastor was alive. This situation is radically transformed by a sumptuous feast that Babette prepares for the sect to mark the 100th anniversary of the birth of the deceased pastor. Babette sacrifices her entire winnings from a lottery ticket to buy the food and drink for the occasion, and as the feast progresses, the pious Lutheran sect is transformed through her self-sacrificing act into a community radiating with love and joy. My atheist colleague at the event in Sheffield used this film to speak about how changes in life brought about through acts of kindness and self-sacrifice represent purely imminent transformations, what I called self-transcendence. Babette's feast was for him an allegory of how goodness transforms groups into communities. I was fascinated by this allusion to Babette's feast by my atheist colleague, because when I first saw this film as a theological student in Paris, I had immediately identified it as a story of Eucharistic transformation, which is to say, as a form of religious transcendence. Each of us clearly watched the film from our own religious and non-religious perspectives. We were living proof of the Gestalt Switch operative in the religious and non-religious dialogue that evening in Sheffield Cathedral. I can understand how my atheist colleague could interpret this film from a secular humanist perspective. and I'm sure he would be able to understand how I could interpret it from a religious perspective. There is no doubt that such generosity transforms communities, regardless of whether it is done for religious or non-religious motives. But the question is, what difference does it make if one views Babette's feast as a secular or a religious allegory? Viewed from a religious point of view, or at least from a Christian point of view, the generosity of Babette in her act of self-sacrifice not only unites the sect into a community, that is to say, it is not only an imminent act of self-transcendence, it also unites this community with God. It is also an act of religious transcendence. As St. Augustine characterizes it, the act of self-sacrifice effects the Eucharistic transformation of the community into a communion with God and is itself nothing less than divine. This opens up the community beyond a purely immanent act of self-transcendence to a relationship which is not reducible to itself. It is the acknowledgement of the presence of the other in its midst, which characterizes a religious reading of Babette's feast. This is a difference which decenters the community from itself, even as it unites the sect into a community. It is the acknowledgement of this double decentering that distinguishes the religious from the non-religious interpretation of a film such as Babette's Feast. The theological task today is to find ways of articulating just what this double decentering means in human experience and what it contributes to those Babette's Feast moments of life. But we should recognize that whilst theology may contribute to this task, we should not overestimate its capacity to do this alone. Actions speak louder than words, and consequently, it is through the living witness of holy women and men that a tangible and immediate access to the reality of this double decentering is made available. Once this transcendent, immanent, Möbius space becomes an embodied reality, the language of transcendence represents not simply the pious speculation of the disengaged theologian, but rather the living narrative of the resurrected Christ in the engaged and doubly decentered community. This is why, as history teaches us, renewal in theology, as well as taking place through dialogue with skeptics, also needs to go hand in hand with a profound renewal in the church. Thank you very much.
Actions speak louder than words, but your words spoke very loud tonight. Thank you very much. Abbiamo un microfono per le domande? Grazie. You have your headset there for translation. Possiamo raccogliere domande e abbiamo la traduzione per il professor Carroll.
Thank you very much for this extremely interesting lecture. My name is Boris Rehmer. I'm a researcher at the Center for Religious Studies. I have two questions. One concerns just, I think, your use of a certain terminology, because you sometimes used the expression or the distinction between religious believers and non-religious believers. And sometimes you said instead the religious and the non-religious. So I was wondering whether there's any, I don't know, why, I mean, there are two interpretations of the terms religious believers and non-religious believers. One is just to say, well, everybody believes lots of things. And some among the things that they believe have religious beliefs and some don't. Or do you intend the word believer to have a particular significance in that context, in the sense that you want to say, even if someone is a non-religious believer, he or she is still a believer in some strong sense of the word? The second point is concerns the central role of religious experience. And you quoted, unfortunately I forget whom you quoted, as saying, well, the worry is not really that, having understood correctly the arguments that are in play, but whether the worry is really whether I've had the relevant experience. And my point here would be to say, well, even if, and then you said, well, and this leads to the fact that religious disagreements should not be reduced to epistemic disagreements. But then the religious experience is not, I mean, religious experience is not really answerable in a direct way to the true-false distinction in the primary, in one sense at least. It's rather answerable to the distinction between, well, it exists or it doesn't. Someone has had the experience or someone hasn't had the experience. And even if someone has had the experience, the question of whether, I mean, what philosophers of religion are interested in, some at least, is the true-false distinction. And even if someone has had the experience, the relevant experience, that does not entail, well, that it's veridical. So these are my two.
Thank you very much. On the first point, I don't mean a distinction between the religious and the religious believer. So there is no distinction in the paper that I intend. They are synonymous. On the second point, and thank you very much for raising what is a difficult question, I think, and let me have a stab at explaining how I'm beginning to tackle this. I am trying not to speak for people who claim themselves to be non-religious or non-religious believers. They tell me in the dialogue they are non-religious. Some say they're atheists, some agnostic, and so on. So I accept their self-description of themselves. One of those who we've been involved with is Raymond Tallis, the chap I quoted from, who is a sort of polymath, poet, medical researcher, and so on, philosopher. And it was his quote I used. And I suppose I'm coming at it more from an anthropological point of view, to try and understand someone like Raymond Tallis, who knows all the arguments for and against religious belief, but has a concern that they lack a certain type of experience. That, in a way, is the Max Weber idea of musicality, that are some people just not very musical in the way people don't get a certain piece of music and so on? Is there an analogy to the religious experience for some people? Max Weber thought that was the case. Raymond Tallis seems to also think it's the case. So the question of religious experience is, I think, something which seems to distinguish different groups at an anthropological level. And so it seems to me that one area that we need to look at more closely is how that understanding of experience is interpreted through religious and non-religious mindsets. And that, I think, is the approach I'm trying to take at the moment. It's not to presume that everybody is really religious at all. I think that was the mistake of a previous generation. The great thinkers like Karl Rahner, for example, presumed everybody's really religious. I think if we're to let people speak for themselves, some people are saying they're not religious at all. One possible way to look at that might be through the musical analogy of some people are just not musical. They just don't get Bach, or they don't get the Beatles. That's certainly the case. Is it analogously the case with the repertoire of people's experience of life within which religious experience nestles and has its place? Perhaps.
I just follow on this, and what about the distinction between religious belief and belief? Because this applies to, I wouldn't put on you the label believer. Still, if I understand you correctly, meaning religious believer, because that's what you deny a being. But there's still some possibility of a different, that's the question actually. Is there still some possibility of a belief of a different kind and a believer of a different kind, and people who disengage themselves from any such characterization as a religious believer? Well, would they accept? Is there a possibility to engage in a dialogue with them in terms of a different kind of belief? What do you, it's a double question referring to both your experience of dialogue with them, or with this category of people, and it's a question, from a theoretical point of view as well.
I think the question is something we found quite difficult to find a vocabulary for, because both the person I work with, Richard Norman, who is an atheist, self-declared atheist, and myself, did not like the title. And the more we worked together, we found it less appealing to have sort of the religious and the non-religious there, as if they're completely distinct groups. But it became impossible to talk about the issue unless we had at least an analytical distinction which had some bearing on how people self-declared their experience to be. That is a proviso to the question of, is it possible that people who claim themselves to be non-believers have some kind of belief? Again, I would come at that more from an anthropological point of view. My experience is there is a great spectrum of self-description of people who self-profess to be non-believers or non-religious believers. One aspect of that group is clearly a rejection of institutionalized forms of religion. And that's a significant group, I think. If you dig on a lot of the people that we've been working with, they often have had a religious background and have rejected that. So there is a sense in which that they are perhaps open to a belief, but not in the institutionalized, straightforward creedal sense. The language to talk about that is often today very difficult to find. You may have in Italy too humanist burials and humanist services. Trying to find non-religious language for the religious rites of passage is quite a challenge for humanist communities. I know them quite well in the UK. They often tend to use the religious language and sort of secularize that language to talk about those rites of passage. But they do want to talk about the meaning of life, the beauty of life, the value of the life, and the value of the person in their own language. Is that to say that they have some kind of religious belief or not? I'm cautious to say they have a religious belief, because for these people, they self-define themselves as nones, non-religious. And I think we should take that seriously and not speak over them. And so, in a way, I haven't invented that category. That is a category people who self-declare to be non-believers have chosen to use for themselves. And I think it is respectful in the dialogue to accept the categories people use for themselves, whilst at the same time allowing those to change and develop as time longitudinally goes on and changes might happen.
Il film Il pranzo di Babette è il film preferito.
Secondo soltanto che verifichiamo se ha la traduzione.
Il film Il pranzo di Babette è il film preferito da Papa Francesco. Nel ritorno dal suo ultimo viaggio, sull'aereo, una giornalista francese ha chiesto a Papa Francesco proprio, nell'incontro con i buddisti, con i musulmani, ma anche con gli atei, per lei è più importante la pace, la convivenza o ottenere la conversione dell'altro. Papa Francesco ha risposto condannando esplicitamente ogni tentativo di proselitismo, di mantenere il dialogo aperto a ogni esito, a ogni risultato. Ecco, proprio Davide Zordan in un suo scritto ha notato che in una società secolarizzata ognuno crede a modo suo, perché l'ateismo nella società moderna è legittimato. Il mondo, la natura, la storia funzionano anche senza Dio. E un ateo può vivere nella natura e nella storia dando senso alla vita anche senza riferimenti alla trascendenza. La mia domanda è questa, che è una domanda anche personale, mi rendo conto. La fede oggi è attraversata con frequenza dall'incredulità. Il dubbio che ci fa oscillare fra la fede e l'incredulità. È possibile? Grazie.
Thank you very much for that question. I would distinguish two different levels of dealing with that. One is perhaps the level which says, in the end, we will all agree. And so we'll come round to one point of view or another. I personally feel there is an underdetermination of data for any theory in this area. And that's why I use the Gestalt Switch example. There are plural ways to see this, and I don't see that as a deficit. I see that as the nature of transcendence and the cognitive incapacity of the human consciousness to determine the facts of the matter. If we see it as a problem, we will try and convert the other side to whatever our position is, either the believer or the non-believer position. And I think for a great deal of human history, that has been the way we've gone about it. I'm exploring the possibility, actually, the duality is not a deficit. It's to do with the nature of this particular domain. Just as I use the analogy of the wave-particle duality or the Gestalt switch, it is an inappropriate question to say, is it a chalice or two faces? Is it a wave or a particle? And it's incredibly difficult for us to get used to that, because we want to say it's either this or it's that. This dialogue, I think, is moving us into an interesting new epistemological area where the question of, is there a fact of the matter, is actually a category mistake question. It's not that type of a question. So in terms of the doubt and the belief, it seems to me that at that level, the strategy is not to try and convert one to the other, but to understand in separate people how one will be more dominant than another, belief or unbelief, and through most people in experience, belief and unbelief runs through, whether you're Pope Francis or whether you're Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins usually goes to the 9 carols at Christ Church in Oxford most Christmases because he loves, as many atheists do, the aesthetic of the religion. Is that a form of religious belief? You'd have to ask Richard Dawkins. We should not speak for people now. I think we need to allow people to say it in their own language. So in terms of the question that you raise, I think this belief and unbelief, I think, goes through anyone, no more than in the archetype of St. Thomas. In a way, this is why I think St. Thomas is the patron saint of the renewal of theology. Because only through the better doubting and the better critique and better skepticism do you move the project on, just as in the natural sciences. Unless you're prepared to abandon theories, you won't progress. And Raymond Tallis, when we met, was astounded that there could be progress in theology. And I said, of course. But he was very right. The notion that you can't progress seems to be embedded in a way of thinking about theology that has not used or learned from the scientific method, which tests, looks at, rejects, accepts, modifies with experience. Would that the theological method had that degree of scientificity about it? And maybe that's an area we're beginning to move in religious studies now.
Thank you very much, Tony, for the beautiful talk. A lot of what you said in your talk, and I'm especially thinking about your moving reflection on the significance of Holy Saturday in the Paschal mystery, revolves around the goal, I would say, of expanding our sense of reality. So how do we expand our sense of reality? That is a question. Well, imagination seems to be crucial here. And you didn't focus on imagination, though in your paper, Davide did in his theological work. So my question is, well, he was worried about the fact that imagination seems to be a very private thing. And so how do you see imagination in this regard as a means to expand dialogue and extend our sense of reality so that we can include much more than we are able to include now? So, but thank you very much for your talk, Tony.
Thank you very much, Paolo, and thank you for a really important question, and I'm glad to be able to say something about imagination, because I read the book you sent me, that you wrote with David, and the importance of imagination was something I thought I can't fit in now. I had too much already. Let me give one example, I think, of what I've found empirically in this work of dialogue. One of the people we've worked with is Professor Angie Hobbs, who works at the University of Sheffield for the public understanding of philosophy. And the article she contributed to our book was about the importance of using imagination from interdisciplinary contexts to fertilize different domains. And she used the example of Isaac Newton. Newton apparently got the idea of the force field, the notion of gravity and so on, from his reading of theologians and philosophers such as Ficino. Newton was also very much interested in alchemy in the time, and this cross-fertilization of the scientific imagination of Sir Isaac Newton by the theological imagination of people like Ficino, and also the Neoplatonic work that was being received at that time, gave rise to extraordinarily powerful scientific breakthroughs, such as the notion of a field rather than simply particulate reality. I think the great adventure we are beginning to enter upon now is the opportunity for different disciplines to share their rich imaginations with each other, to, in a similar way to Isaac Newton making that breakthrough of the notion of fields and so on, we can rethink some of these basic concepts that occur in different domains. One example, I think, that I know some people are working on at the moment is the notion of the hologram. You know, a hologram is a 3D image, a recording of a light field in three-dimensional space. And some people think the origin of our three-dimensional universe is a hologram of what was prior to that, a four-dimensional reality. So a sort of holographic projection of the universe into a three-dimensional space that we know. These images, imagination are extraordinarily rich for helping us to think of how do we understand how different dimensions of reality relate to each other. In the holographic principle, that's four-dimensional space to what we know as three-dimensional space. In the paper I've just given, it's the example of how does transcendence, understood in dimensional terms, relate to immanence. The notion of holography is an extraordinarily rich mathematical and physical area now of research that theology could really do extraordinarily work with, because it gives a vocabulary for how dimensions of reality relate to one another, which has been the struggle to think about transcendence and immanence in our particular moment of history, where people think of heaven in a sort of literal sense as up there, and they've gone to the other side. We are so impoverished in our religious language often. Very serious, rational, critical people say, that doesn't give me anything to go on. If we can engage theologically with those sorts of areas, just like with Newton, we might have some serious language to help people to situate themselves in pluridimensional realities.
Thank you very much for your lesson, which is so rich in point of reflection. But the develop of your discussion focused me on an ancient answer, and is how is useful or necessary to get an answer at the human to their necessity of transcendence. And I think the dictionary is to get a point of view of ethic confrontation between the authoritarian ethics and human ethics. Probably, I think that today the awareness of the human awareness need to have an answer which the authoritarian ethics is not able to do at the human. Because my answer, I think that that's an opportunity to a return of the humanitarian ethics, to deploy the human to get the powerful in a life and existence. And I will grateful if you get your think about that.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I captured all of the question, but let me have a go at raising. One of the reasons I chose the category of transcendence is because the category of transcendence has historically, and this goes through the Asian traditions, the Western traditions, philosophy, and the Judeo-Christian tradition, in other words, the axial traditions. The concept of transcendence has been the medium through which we have thought universality. And the concept of universality is the basis for how we've thought about international rights, ethics, human dignity. A foundational level of our understanding of our ethics has broken down, I think, recently because of the crisis of thinking the universal. And I think the reason for the crisis for thinking the universal is at least in significant part related to the crisis of the transcendence-imminence relation. And I think that's the historical reason for the crisis at the moment. And the return, for example, at the normative level or political level, to the nation state rather than supranational and international political institutions. Part of the reason is because of the lack of belief in that sort of universalism which someone like Bruno Kessler would have believed in and Gasperi believed in. In other words, the European Union is founded on that. I can speak as coming from, from the part of the world I come from. And part of the analysis of what's happening, I think at this sort of slightly abstract level, but I hope not irrelevant level, is because of the crisis of knowing what we mean by the universal due to this incapacity to think transcendence and imminence, which goes through philosophy, the Asian traditions, the religious traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as well. And that's a global problem. And it seems to me, if we are to find a way forward, because at the moment we're taking the nostalgic move backwards, it seems to me, we will have to rethink the universal and transcendence.
So thank you very much. I mean, on this final note, linking your reflection to even politics, and in a very wise way. I take advantage of this final note to express my gratitude and thanks. This has been really a great lesson and an exercise of theology in the deepest sense, and I take this as a strong encouragement for our exercise here at the center. You don't need to betray theology or give up theology to think deep about issues so relevant for our life today, including thinking about science, as you mentioned, in your challenge to theology, in learning from scientific method, for instance. And it's been so rich. There's plenty of food for thought. And we're also grateful for your contribution of a text which will be published and which will give us material for further elaboration. So I invite the public to join me in appreciation for in gratitude. Thank you so much. Grazie a tutti, grazie a Paolo Costa per l'idea di invitare Anthony Carrol per la preparazione e la sua splendida introduzione. Siamo tutti invitati a restare per cena ora qui fuori, buffet. E vi ricordo che domani sera avremo Franco Garelli nell'inaugurazione dell'anno del CSSR e sarà un altro appuntamento molto prezioso. È qui con noi, Franco Garelli è stato qui stasera e siamo anche particolarmente lieti di questa coincidenza dei due eventi, no? E questo passaggio di testimone dalla teologia e la filosofia alla sociologia. Grazie ancora e accomodatevi per cena.